The baby's cry cut through the desert silence like a blade through her heart. Sarah's breasts had been dry for 2 days now, her body betraying the one thing that mattered most. When the tall farmer appeared at her broken wagon, his calloused hand extended not in charity, but in proposition, she knew her old life was ending. "Your baby needs milk, and I need a woman," he said, his voice rough as the wind carved stones around them. The words hung between them like a bridge over an impossible canyon, and Sarah realized she was already stepping across. Don't miss what happens when desperation meets desire. Subscribe now to follow Sarah's journey from the edge of survival to the heart of something she never expected. The wagon wheel had cracked 3 miles back, and now Sarah sat in the shade of its tilted frame, watching her 6-month-old son's face redden with hunger she could not satisfy. Her dress clung to her body with the sweat of fear and exhaustion, the fabric dark with moisture that should have been milk, but had dried up like everything else in this God-forsaken stretch of Arizona territory. The sun hammered down on the endless expanse of red dirt and scattered sage, and she pressed little Thomas closer to her chest, feeling the terrible emptiness where abundance should have been. She had tried everything. The herbs the Mexican woman in the last town had given her, the prayers whispered until her throat was raw, even pressing warm cloths to her breasts until they ached. Nothing came, and Thomas's cries grew weaker with each passing hour, his tiny fists no longer fighting, but simply trembling against her skin. The silence between his cries was worse than the sound itself, stretching out like the desert around them, vast and merciless. Sarah's husband had been dead 3 months now, taken by fever in a town whose name she could barely remember, and she had been traveling toward her sister's homestead in California with nothing but hope and the last of their savings sewn into her corset. The money was gone now, spent on supplies that had run out and a wagon that had betrayed her when she needed it most, leaving her stranded in a landscape that seemed designed to swallow hope whole. She had not seen another soul for 2 days, and the water in her canteen was down to less than a cup, warm and metallic against her tongue when she allowed herself the smallest sip. Thomas stirred against her, his mouth searching instinctively for what she could not give, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with milk and everything to do with the terrible mathematics of survival. The sound of hoofbeats came like an answer to a prayer she had been afraid to voice, growing louder against the backdrop of wind and her son's fitful whimpering. Sarah struggled to her feet, shading her eyes against the glare, and saw a figure approaching on horseback, a man tall and broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the sun. Her heart hammered with a mixture of relief and terror, because she knew that in this place, at this moment, she had no choice but to trust whatever intentions rode toward her on that horse. The man drew closer, and she could see the weathered lines of his face, the way his eyes took in her situation with a glance that missed nothing, the broken wagon, the crying baby, the desperation that must have been written across her features like words on a page. He dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a solid sound that seemed to anchor the spinning world around her. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who chose his words carefully. "Looks like you're in some trouble here." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, too tight with the weight of everything she needed to say and couldn't find words for. So she simply nodded and held Thomas closer, feeling the baby's breath hot and rapid against her neck. The man's eyes moved from her face to the child and back again, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition that made her stomach clench with both hope and fear. He was perhaps 40, with hands that spoke of hard work, and a face that had been carved by sun and wind into something that might have been handsome if it hadn't been so stern, so carefully controlled. When he spoke again, his words fell into the space between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. "Name's Jacob Morrison," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Good water, milk cow, everything a baby needs to grow strong." Sarah felt her knees weaken with relief, so profound it was almost painful. But something in his tone made her wait, made her listen for the words that would come next. Jacob stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage and honest sweat of him, close enough to see the way his jaw worked as he considered his next words. "Your baby needs milk," he said finally, his voice rough as the desert wind. "And I need a woman." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn, and Sarah realized that her old life, the one where she had choices, where she could afford the luxury of pride, had ended the moment her milk dried up under this merciless sun. The baby's cry rose again, weaker now but still insistent, and Sarah felt the last of her resistance crumble like adobe in the rain. She looked into Jacob Morrison's eyes and saw not cruelty, but a kind of honest need that matched her own, a loneliness that had carved itself into the lines around his eyes and the set of his shoulders. This was not charity he was offering, not rescue in any form she had ever imagined, but something rawer and more honest, a trade between two people who had been worn down to their essential needs by the harsh mathematics of survival. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morrison?" she heard herself ask, her voice steadier than she had expected, and saw something that might have been respect flicker across his weathered features. The desert stretched around them in all directions, vast and unforgiving, and Sarah understood that whatever happened next would be decided not by the woman she had been, but by the woman she was willing to become. Jacob Morrison's ranch house sat low against the horizon, like something that had grown from the earth itself, its adobe walls the same red-brown as the desert around it, its windows dark rectangles that seemed to watch their approach with patient eyes. Sarah rode behind him on his horse, Thomas pressed against her chest, feeling the solid warmth of the man's back through his shirt and the steady rhythm of the animal beneath them. The milk cow he had mentioned stood in a small corral beside the house, her udder heavy with the promise of life, and Sarah felt tears she had been holding back for days finally spill over at the sight of salvation made manifest. Jacob had said little during the ride, only pointing out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a dry creek bed that ran with water in the spring, as if he were already teaching her the geography of her new life. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but charged with the weight of the decision they had both made, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them in the shadow of her broken wagon. The house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with a wide front porch and rooms that opened one into another like chapters in a story she was only beginning to read. Jacob helped her down from the horse with hands that were gentle despite their calluses, and Sarah felt the strange intimacy of being touched by a man who was still essentially a stranger, whose life she was about to enter in ways that made her pulse quicken with something that was not entirely fear. He led her inside, through a front room furnished with handmade chairs and a table that bore the marks of solitary meals, into a kitchen where copper pots hung from hooks and a wood stove radiated warmth that seemed to seep into her bones. "Milk's in the cold box," he said, his voice carefully neutral, and Sarah understood that he was giving her space to process what was happening, time to feed her son before they addressed the other terms of their arrangement. Thomas latched onto the bottle with desperate hunger, his small hands gripping the glass as if he understood how close he had come to losing everything, and Sarah felt her body relax for the first time in days as she watched him drink. Jacob moved around the kitchen with the easy efficiency of a man accustomed to caring for himself, putting coffee on to boil and slicing bread from a loaf that smelled of yeast and home, and Sarah found herself studying the way he moved, economical, purposeful, without the restless energy of someone who was uncomfortable in his own space. When he set a plate before her, their fingers brushed for just a moment, and she felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the fact that she was a woman who had been alone too long, and he was a man whose presence filled the room like warmth from a fire. "Eat," he said simply, and she realized she was starving for more than just food, hungry for the simple human kindness of being cared for. The bread was fresh and the butter sweet, and as Sarah ate, she felt strength returning to her body along with something else. A growing awareness of the man across from her, the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful distance he maintained as if he were afraid of frightening her away. Thomas had fallen asleep in her arms, his belly full for the first time in days, and the sight of his peaceful face made Sarah's chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "He's a fine boy," Jacob said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her look up sharply, something that spoke of loss and longing that went deeper than the practical need for companionship. "You have children, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, and saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly before he shook his head. "Had a wife once," he said after a long moment. "She couldn't carry to term, lost 3 before the fever took her." The words fell into the space between them like stones into deep water, and Sarah understood that his need for a woman was not just about loneliness or physical desire, but about the dream of family that had been torn away from him. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Sarah found herself really looking at Jacob Morrison for the first time, not as a stranger who had offered salvation, but as a man whose own wounds had led him to this moment. He was handsome in a weathered way, with strong hands and eyes the color of sage, and when he smiled at something Thomas did in his sleep, she saw a gentleness that made her stomach flutter with something that was definitely not fear. "I should show you the rest of the house," he said, rising from his chair, and Sarah understood that this was the moment when they would move from the practical matter of feeding her son to the more complex negotiations of what their arrangement would actually mean. She followed him through rooms that spoke of a man's solitary life, a bedroom with a bed large enough for 2, but clearly slept in by 1, a washstand with a single towel, clothes hanging on pegs with too much space between them. When they reached the room that would be hers, with its narrow bed and small window that looked out over the desert, Sarah felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders like a cloak. "This can be your room," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral, "if that's what you want." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Sarah understood that he was giving her a choice even now, even after she had accepted his proposition in the desert. She looked at the narrow bed, then at the man standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and his eyes fixed on something beyond her shoulder, and felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening. "And if it's not what I want?" she heard herself ask, her voice barely above a whisper, and saw his eyes snap to hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then you sleep where you choose," he said simply. And Sarah realized that what she had taken for a transaction was actually something much more complicated, an invitation into a life where she would have agency, where her choices would matter, where the woman she became would be shaped not by desperation, but by desire. Chapters 3-5. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Sarah had never known, the steady pulse of shared labor, the quiet understanding that grew between glances across the breakfast table, the way Thomas would pause in his work to watch her feed the baby in the shade of the porch. She found herself moving through his house with increasing confidence, rearranging small things, adding touches that made the space feel less like a bachelor's refuge and more like a home. The baby thrived on the fresh milk, his cheeks growing round and pink, his cries becoming less frequent and more purposeful. Thomas had fashioned a cradle from old barnwood, sanding it smooth with his own hands, and Sarah would often find him standing beside it in the evenings, watching the child sleep with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. The work was hard but satisfying in ways that surprised her. She learned to milk the cows, her hands growing strong and sure on the warm udders, learned to gather eggs without startling the hens, learned to read the sky for signs of weather that might threaten the crops. Thomas taught her with patience, his large hands covering hers to show her the proper grip, the right pressure, the gentle firmness that animals respected. These moments of instruction became something more, opportunities for touch that lingered longer than necessary, for conversations that revealed pieces of themselves they had kept hidden. She discovered that he had been married once, briefly, to a woman who couldn't bear the isolation of ranch life and had left him for a banker in Denver. He learned that she had been a schoolteacher before marriage, that she could read Latin and recite poetry, that her dreams had once extended far beyond the boundaries of any man's land. The physical space between them began to shrink with each passing day. What had started as careful politeness evolved into something more intimate. The brush of fingers when passing dishes at dinner, the way he would steady her elbow when she climbed down from the wagon, the increasing frequency with which she would find reasons to enter whatever room he occupied. The house itself seemed to encourage this closeness, its small rooms and narrow hallways creating opportunities for proximity that felt both accidental and inevitable. She began to notice things about him that had nothing to do with his usefulness. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful way he handled delicate things, the sound of his laughter when the baby grabbed his finger with surprising strength. The nights were the most challenging, filled with an awareness that hummed between their separate bedrooms like a taut wire. Sarah would lie awake listening to the sounds of his movement through the house, the creak of floorboards under his weight, the soft closing of doors, the rustle of fabric as he prepared for sleep. She found herself imagining what it would be like to cross that hallway, to knock softly on his door, to accept the invitation that seemed to hang unspoken in every conversation they shared. The baby's midnight feedings became exercises in restraint as she would pass his room and see the thin line of lamplight beneath his door, knowing he was awake, knowing he was as aware of her presence as she was of his. The turning point came on a Sunday evening when a sudden storm trapped them inside together. The wind howled around the house with a ferocity that made the windows rattle and the walls seem to breathe. The baby, frightened by the noise, refused to settle, and Sarah found herself walking the floor with him, singing soft lullabies that were barely audible above the storm. Thomas emerged from his room in his nightshirt, his hair tousled from sleep, and without a word took the child from her arms. The baby quieted almost immediately, soothed by the deep rumble of Thomas's voice as he hummed an old cowboy song. They stood together in the lamplight, the three of them forming a tableau that felt both temporary and eternal, and Sarah realized that what she had been fighting was not just desire, but the recognition that this man, this child, this life, had become home in ways she had never expected. When the storm finally passed and Thomas handed the sleeping baby back to her, their fingers touched in the transfer, and neither of them pulled away. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility, with the weight of decisions that would change everything, and Sarah understood that the next word spoken would determine not just the night ahead, but the shape of all the nights that would follow. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the house. Sarah moved through her morning routine with heightened awareness, conscious of Thomas's presence in ways that made even simple tasks feel charged with significance. He was more attentive than usual, bringing her coffee without being asked, lingering near her as she prepared breakfast, finding excuses to touch her hand or shoulder in passing. The baby seemed to sense the change as well, becoming more alert and responsive, reaching for Thomas whenever he came near, as if recognizing him as a permanent fixture in their small world. The work of the day provided a welcome distraction, but even routine tasks carried new weight. When Thomas suggested they ride out to check the far pastures, Sarah found herself agreeing despite her inexperience with horses. He saddled a gentle mare for her, adjusting the stirrups with careful attention, his hands lingering on her ankle as he checked the fit. The ride across the open range was a revelation. The vast sky stretching endlessly above them, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her, the sense of freedom that came from being small figures in an immense landscape. Thomas rode beside her with easy confidence, pointing out landmarks, sharing stories of the land's history, his voice carrying on the wind like a promise of belonging. They stopped beside a creek that wound through a grove of cottonwoods, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. While the horses drank, Thomas spread a blanket in the shade, and they shared the lunch Sarah had packed, the baby sleeping peacefully in a basket between them. The conversation flowed more easily here, away from the confines of the house, and Sarah found herself telling him things she had never shared with anyone. Her fears about motherhood, her dreams of a different life, the loneliness that had driven her to accept his offer. He listened without judgment, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished speaking, he reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. The kiss, when it came, felt both inevitable and surprising. It started gently, a question asked and answered, but deepened quickly into something more urgent, more necessary. Sarah felt herself responding with a hunger that shocked her, her body awakening to sensations she had thought lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers and whispered words that sounded like a prayer. The baby stirred in his basket, reminding them of the world beyond their desire, but the spell was not broken, merely suspended, waiting for the right moment to resume. The ride back to the ranch was charged with anticipation. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared smile carried the weight of what had passed between them and the promise of what was to come. Sarah found herself studying Thomas with new eyes, noticing the strength in his hands as he held the reins, the way his body moved with the horse's rhythm, the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from him like heat. She began to understand that what she felt was not just gratitude or even simple attraction, but something deeper, a recognition of partnership, of the possibility of building something together that would be stronger than either of them could create alone. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas spoke the words that had been building between them all day. He told her that what had started as a practical arrangement had become something he had never expected to find again. Not just companionship, but love. He asked her to marry him, not out of obligation or convenience, but because he could no longer imagine his life without her in it. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that somewhere in the midst of survival and necessity, she had found not just safety but joy, not just shelter but home. Her answer came not in words but in action, as she leaned across the space between their chairs and kissed him with all the certainty she felt in her heart. The baby, as if sensing the significance of the moment, chose that instant to wake and gurgle with what sounded remarkably like approval, and they both laughed, the sound carrying across the empty prairie like a declaration of hope. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church in town, with only the preacher's wife and the general store owner as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Thomas had bought for her, the fabric soft and new against her skin, and carried wildflowers that he had picked that morning from the meadow behind the house. The baby, dressed in a christening gown that had belonged to Thomas's family, slept peacefully in Sarah's arms throughout the brief ceremony, as if blessing their union with his presence. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Promises not just of love and fidelity, but of partnership in building a life from the raw materials of hope and determination. The celebration was modest, but heartfelt. The preacher's wife had prepared a small cake, and the store owner produced a bottle of champagne that had been gathering dust on his shelves for years. They toasted their future with the kind of quiet joy that comes from understanding the true value of what has been found. Thomas had arranged for them to spend their wedding night at the hotel in town, a luxury that felt almost decadent after weeks of ranch life. The room was small but clean, with lace curtains and a view of the main street, and Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness as she realized that this night would mark the true beginning of their marriage. The intimacy that followed was a revelation of tenderness and passion that surprised them both. What had begun as necessity had transformed into genuine desire, and they came together with a hunger that spoke of more than physical need. Thomas was gentle but sure, his hands mapping the contours of her body with reverent attention, and Sarah found herself responding with an abandon she had never known she possessed. They made love with the desperate intensity of people who had found something precious and were determined not to let it slip away, and afterward lay entwined in the lamplight, speaking in whispers of their plans and dreams. The return to the ranch the next day felt like coming home in the truest sense. The house that had once seemed like a temporary shelter now felt like the foundation of their shared future. Sarah moved through the rooms with new confidence, rearranging furniture, hanging curtains, making changes that reflected their combined tastes and needs. Thomas watched her with obvious pleasure, occasionally offering suggestions, but mostly content to let her transform the space into something that belonged to both of them. The baby, now officially their son, through adoption papers Thomas had quietly arranged, seemed to thrive in the atmosphere of settled happiness, his laughter filling rooms that had been silent for too long. The work of the ranch took on new meaning as well. What had once been Thomas's solitary struggle became their shared enterprise, and Sarah discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the business side of farming. She took over the bookkeeping, corresponded with buyers in distant cities, and even suggested improvements to their operations that increased both efficiency and profits. Thomas, who had always been suspicious of change, found himself deferring to her judgment more and more often, recognizing that her education and quick mind were assets he had never thought to value. Their partnership extended beyond the personal into the practical, creating a foundation of mutual respect that strengthened their emotional bond. The seasons turned, and with them came the rhythms of ranch life that marked the passage of time in ways both subtle and profound. Spring brought new calves and the backbreaking work of planting. Summer brought long days of haying and the constant vigilance required to protect crops from drought and pests. Autumn brought harvest and the satisfaction of seeing their labor transformed into tangible results. Through it all, Sarah and Thomas worked side by side, their relationship deepening with each shared challenge and triumph. The baby grew into a toddler who followed them everywhere, his presence a constant reminder of the family they had created from the raw materials of need and hope. As winter approached and they prepared for their first full year together, Sarah often found herself marveling at the journey that had brought her to this place. What had begun as a desperate bargain had become the foundation of a life richer and more fulfilling than any she had dared to imagine. Standing on the porch in the evening light, watching Thomas play with their son in the yard, she understood that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from grand gestures or dramatic changes, but from the simple decision to trust in the possibility of love, even when it arrives in the most unexpected forms.